I am not, by nature, a vengeful person. I want to establish that up front, because by the end of this story, you might think otherwise, and I'd like you to have the full picture. I'm a planner. I'm methodical. I believe in documentation the way some people believe in prayer, not as a guarantee, but as the closest thing to one available in an uncertain world. What I did to my former boss, Derek Paulson, was not an act of rage. It was an act of record keeping. The rage came first, years earlier, and by the time I did anything with it, it had cooled into something much more useful. Let me tell you about Derek. I joined Callaway and Marsh, a mid-sized marketing consultancy based in Atlanta, in the spring of 2018. I was 27, freshly MBA'd, and operating under the reasonable assumption that if I worked hard and produced results, the results would speak for themselves. This is an assumption that a great many young women in professional environments make and subsequently have to unlearn, usually at a significant personal cost. My unlearning took 3 years and cost me 2 promotions and a degree of professional confidence I'm still in the process of rebuilding. Derek Paulson was my direct supervisor from day one. He was 41, broadly liked, politically savvy in the way people are when they've spent 15 years learning which relationships matter and how to maintain them. He had good teeth and a firm handshake, and remembered everyone's spouse's name and alma mater, which in a certain corporate culture passes for emotional intelligence. He was the kind of man who fills a room without saying anything particularly substantive, and who had built an entire career on that capacity. Within 6 months of joining his team, I understood that Derek was not especially good at his job. He was good at the surrounding architecture of the job, the meetings, the presentations, the client dinners, the internal politics. But the actual strategic work, the analysis and ideation and execution that produced results for clients, was done by his team. Specifically, increasingly, by me. I don't say this out of arrogance. I say it because it's what the record shows, which is exactly the point. My first major project at Callaway and Marsh was a brand repositioning strategy for a regional healthcare network. I spent 11 weeks on it. Primary research, competitive analysis, messaging framework, the full package. Derek attended 3 of the client meetings. He contributed in those meetings the kind of broad affirmatory statements that signal engagement without adding content. That's exactly the direction we want to push. And our team has really dug into this, and Kieran here has been driving the research. That last one was almost an acknowledgement. Almost. When the client signed a contract extension worth $340,000 on the strength of that strategy, Derek's name was on the congratulatory email from our managing director. My name was not mentioned. I told myself this was normal, that credit flows upward in hierarchies, that my time would come. The second project was a full campaign strategy for a consumer goods company, launching a new product line. 14 weeks. I built the audience segmentation model from scratch, developed the channel strategy, wrote the creative brief, and managed 3 junior team members through the execution. Derek presented it to the client and answered questions by largely repeating things I had briefed him on that morning in the car on the way to the meeting. That client became our second largest account. Derek received a performance bonus. I received a 3% merit raise and feedback in my annual review that I needed to work on executive presence. By year 2, I had developed a theory about Derek that I tested quietly over several months. My theory was that Derek's reputation rested almost entirely on the output of whoever reported to him, and that he had cultivated a specific skill for presenting other people's work as the product of a team. Team being a word that, in Derek's usage, was synonymous with himself. He wasn't sloppy about it. He didn't put his name on documents he hadn't touched. What he did was more sophisticated. He made himself the visible face of every output, ensured that his relationships with senior leadership and clients were the primary relationship, and kept his team members in a position of productive obscurity, where our work was visible but our identities were not. When I tested this theory by beginning to copy senior colleagues on emails where I summarized project progress in my own name, carefully, not aggressively, just establishing a paper trail of authorship, Derek called me into his office and told me warmly that communication on client projects should flow through him to avoid mixed messaging. He smiled when he said it. I smiled back. I said, "Of course." I went back to my desk and opened a new folder on my personal hard drive that I labeled with a certain grim satisfaction, documentation. Year 2 was when I started keeping records in earnest, not secretly in any dramatic sense, just diligently. Every strategy document I produced, I retained a dated copy in my personal drive with metadata intact. Every email briefing Derek before a meeting, I kept. Every Slack message where a junior team member tagged me as the author of a deliverable, I screenshotted. Every client email that came directly to me, which happened increasingly as the clients got to know me, I archived. I also started doing something that felt small at the time, but turned out to matter enormously. I began sending recap emails after every significant internal meeting. Per our discussion today, the approach I'll be developing for the Henderson account is as follows. Simple, professional, the kind of thing you could call administrative housekeeping. Derek never objected to them because they looked like diligence, not documentation. But what they were doing, slowly and methodically over many months, was building a time-stamped record of my intellectual contribution to every major project that crossed our team's desk. In year 3, Derek was promoted to vice president. I want to describe what it felt like to sit in the all-hands meeting where that announcement was made, but I'm not sure I have the vocabulary for it. The managing director talked about Derek's visionary approach to client strategy and his exceptional track record of delivering growth. I sat in the third row and kept my face arranged into an expression of pleasant professionalism and felt something inside me go very cold and very quiet. That was the day I stopped waiting for the system to correct itself and started thinking about what I was actually going to do.
I had, by that point, approximately 2 years of documentation. I had a clear record of authorship on 7 major strategic projects, 4 of which had directly resulted in account expansions or contract renewals, totaling, by my rough calculation, somewhere north of $2 million in revenue for the firm. I had dated files showing my drafts predating any version Derek had presented. I had the recap emails. I had, crucially, a pattern of client correspondence in which clients frequently emailed me directly to continue conversations about strategy, conversations that Derek had publicly initiated in meetings, but that clients apparently preferred to continue with me, which said something neither of us had ever said out loud. I also had something I hadn't anticipated, an ally. Her name was Renata, and she was a senior account director who had joined the firm about 8 months before Derek's promotion. Renata was sharp, experienced, and had apparently been watching the dynamic I'd been living with the observational interest of someone who recognized it from elsewhere. She approached me after a client presentation in which I had handled the entire Q&A while Derek nodded alongside, a thing that happened regularly enough that I'd stopped noticing it, and said simply, "You did all the work on that campaign, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, 3 years. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Do you have documentation?" I said I had a folder. She smiled, not warmly exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed. "Good," she said. "Keep adding to it. There's a mid-year review of VP performance coming in 4 months. I sit on that committee." I want to be clear that what followed was not a conspiracy. Renata did not coach me to fabricate anything or manipulate anyone. What she did was tell me that the mid-year review process involved an assessment of each VP's team productivity and contribution metrics, a process that Derek had apparently navigated smoothly in previous years by presenting aggregate team output as his leadership achievement, which worked when nobody on the review committee had visibility into the actual distribution of work. What Renata was offering was visibility. Over the following 3 months, I organized my documentation into a coherent presentation, not an emotional one, no language about feeling uncredited or overlooked, no narrative of personal grievance, just a clean record, project by project, deliverable by deliverable, with dates, metadata, email chains, and a simple column showing the revenue outcome associated with each project. I calculated a conservative estimate of the revenue I could directly attribute to work I had originated. It was $2.3 million over 3 years. I also put together something I called internally the attribution gap analysis, a comparison of the public record of credit, meeting presentations, announcement emails, award nominations, against the documented record of authorship. It was not a flattering comparison for Derek. It was not designed to be. The mid-year VP review was a committee meeting. I was not in the room. Renata was. What I know about what happened in that room comes from Renata's account, delivered to me over coffee the following morning, and it goes like this. The committee reviewed each VP's performance package. When they got to Derek, Renata raised a question about how they were evaluating individual versus team contribution. This prompted a broader discussion. Renata noted that she had some concerns about attribution patterns on Derek's team and asked if the committee would be willing to review supplementary documentation. The committee chair said yes. Renata presented my folder, not as my folder, as documentation she had independently reviewed and felt the committee should see. I had prepared it knowing it would be presented this way, knowing my name needed to stay adjacent to the work rather than attached to the act of presenting it, because a junior employee directly accusing a VP reads as grievance, regardless of how factual the underlying material is. This is a thing I understood about the institution I was operating in, and I played by those rules not because I respected them, but because I needed them to work for me just this once. The committee apparently went quiet when they got to the attribution gap analysis. 2 days later, Derek was called into a meeting with the managing director and HR. I don't know exactly what was said in that meeting. I know it lasted 2 hours. I know Derek left the building afterward and didn't come back that day or the next. What was announced firm-wide approximately a week later was that Derek Paulson had decided to pursue other opportunities and that his team would be restructured under interim leadership while a permanent solution was determined. The language was careful. It always is. What was announced to me in a private meeting with the managing director and Renata 3 days after Derek's departure was more direct. The managing director said the firm had identified a significant gap between documented contribution and recognized contribution on several projects over the past 3 years. He said the firm took these issues seriously. He said they would like to offer me a senior strategy role with a compensation adjustment reflecting my actual contribution to the firm's growth. He did not say the words, "We're sorry." I had not expected him to. I accepted the role. I negotiated the compensation adjustment upward from their initial offer because I had the documentation to support the ask, and I was done being modest about what my work was worth. Renata, across the table, did not quite smile, but her eyes did something adjacent to it. That was 14 months ago. I am a senior strategist at Callaway and Marsh. I present my own work in client meetings. My name is on the congratulatory emails. 2 months ago, I was nominated internally for a regional industry award for a campaign strategy I developed, and the nomination used my name, my specific contribution, my documented results. I don't know where Derek landed. I've heard through the professional grapevine that he's at a smaller firm in Charlotte, which may be true or may be the kind of things people say. I don't spend much time thinking about it. What he does with his career now is his problem. What I did with mine is my story. My advice, for what it's worth, is this: do your work, do it excellently, and do it documented. In institutions that reward visibility over substance, you have to create your own visibility, carefully, patiently, with receipts. Don't perform anger at people who aren't watching. Don't make speeches. Don't quit dramatically. Build the folder. Send the recap emails. Know what your work is worth to the dollar and be prepared to say the number out loud. And find your Renata. She exists in more places than you think. She's the person across the table who's been watching, who knows what she's looking at, who has been waiting for someone to hand her the documentation she already suspected existed. When she asks if you have a folder, tell her yes. Then make sure the folder is very, very good.